We don't have to wait any longer. SpaceX is set to launch Starship Flight 12 this very month. This isn't just a guess. It's based on the current status of Booster 19 and Ship 39, the two vehicles that will make 2026's first big milestone. Interestingly, this launch lines up almost perfectly with the schedule for Artemis 2. So that raises a big question. Which mission matters more for humanity's return to the moon, Starship Flight 12 or Artemis 2? Let's dive into today's episode of Alpha Tech. It's been almost 3 months since 2025's final flight, Flight 11, a mission that gave us so many emotions. The thrill as Starship was engulfed in plasma, the joy when it successfully deployed 8 dummy Starlink, and the heartbreak as both the booster and the ship splashed down and exploded. But in this gap, SpaceX hasn't been standing still. Everything at Starbase has changed at a lightning pace to prepare for an even more thrilling flight. Flight 12, SpaceX's first mission of the new year, made especially for fans. This flight isn't just a test of new hardware. It's also a goldmine for data that will support future lunar missions. So, when exactly is it going to launch? Well, Ship 39 was actually fully stacked back in November, and it should have already rolled out to Massey for cryo-testing. But after Booster 18 suffered a LOX tank rupture, suspected to be caused by the COPVs, SpaceX had to remove all the COPVs from Ship 39 inside Megabay 2 for inspection, and possibly replacement. That added a lot more time than initially planned. Work like this isn't publicized, of course. Megabay 2 is usually closed during these procedures to keep prying eyes, especially from China, away. The last time Ship 39 was spotted was on January 2nd when the bay doors opened, revealing its tall, glossy black form, thanks to its ceramic heat shield tiles, surrounded by a dense web of scaffolding. It's likely they had just finished some work on the heat shield tiles, maybe removing or replacing certain panels, to test a new type they recently developed. It's similar to Flight 5, the first mission to use the new heat shield system. For that flight, SpaceX replaced more than 18,000 tiles from version 1, and added a secondary anti-erosion layer beneath the primary tiles. The result was a major improvement. During that mission, they didn't intentionally remove any heat shield tiles, choosing instead to focus on testing the vehicle's overall stability during atmospheric re-entry. Likewise, for Flight 12, SpaceX will likely keep Ship 39's heat shield fully upgraded without risking large tile removals. They're using what's called a crunch wrap, a soft material wrapped around each tile to seal gaps and prevent superheated plasma from reaching the stainless steel underneath. All of this raises the question, will Ship 39 make it into orbit safely on its first flight? Although SpaceX hasn't officially confirmed it yet, many experts believe it will. After all, the first flight is mainly to test stability. If Ship 39 can reach suborbital altitude successfully, this time, they'll also be pushing the vehicle's limits to check the Raptor 3 engines and other stability structures that SpaceX has added, like the raceways. Raceways are external housings that organize the propellant lines from the main tanks down to the engines, along with electrical cables for control systems, sensors, and various hydraulic lines. They help keep everything neat inside the ship and protect its external structure. In short, Ship 39 is basically ready. The remaining work is just removing all that dense scaffolding so it can be moved out to the Massey site for its cryo test, expected to happen this week. After that, it will return to Megabay 2 to have its engines installed, then be transported back to Massey to the truss structure SpaceX is building for the static fire. That's when we'll finally see the full power of the Raptor 3 engines. It may sound simple, but all these steps will take nearly 3 weeks. That puts Ship 39 ready for flight around January 25th, possibly launching on the 30th or 31st. Of course, the flight also depends on Booster 19. So, what's the status of that right now? Recently, Starbase City announced a road closure, which made many of us think the Booster 19 was being rolled out to Massey. But it wasn't. It was just the ship's aft section. On January 2nd, this aft section was lifted by crane onto Test Tank B, 18.3, to check the strength and load-bearing capabilities of the new design, especially the hot staging ring, the connection point between booster and ship. They'll be using the can crusher, a hydraulic device that simulates engine thrust by compressing the tank, to put pressure on the section and collect data on how it handles stress. Here's the good news. This test lets SpaceX gather data quickly and adjust the design if needed before testing the full Booster 19. Once this test is complete, B-19, already fully stacked, will be rolled out from Mega Bay 1 to Massey for its cryo test, expected to take place before Ship 39, also later this week. After that, the next steps are rolling it back to Mega Bay 1, installing all 33 Raptor 3 engines, then performing the static fire test at Pad 2. SpaceX will also take the opportunity to test the flame trench, the OLM, and the tank farm, since this infrastructure is brand new and has never been fully tested. This whole process is expected to wrap up before January 27th, because installing 33 Raptor 3 engines is no small task, much more complex than the 6 engines on Ship 39. In short, both vehicles should complete all tests by January 27th, getting ready for an exciting flight around the 30th or 31st. This lines up perfectly with the FCC STA, the temporary license from the Federal Communications Commission that allows SpaceX to use specific radio frequencies to communicate with Super Heavy and Starship during Flight 12. It clearly covers January 23, 2026 to June 28, 2026. The period SpaceX expects to need communications for this historic 2026 flight. So, are you pumped to see this beast take off and roar into the sky? Drop a 12 in the comments to show your excitement. If Flight 12 really does happen in late January, there's a good chance it will take place before Artemis 2. On January 31st, NASA shared an important update. Inside the vehicle assembly building at Kennedy Space Center, several retractable platforms have been pulled away from the SLS and Orion spacecraft, marking a major milestone on the road to launch. To be fair, this program hadn't been making great progress for a long time, but with Jared Isaacman's new leadership and strong backing from the government, Artemis 2 is now moving forward amid growing geopolitical tension. Hawkish lawmakers have made it clear lunar exploration is no longer just science. It's a political imperative, especially as China's space program continues to advance rapidly. That political pressure is now translating into a concrete launch timeline. According to NASA spokesperson Bethany Stevens, launch opportunities for Artemis 2 open on February 6th and extend through the spring, with the window lasting no later than April 2026. 4 astronauts, Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen, will fly aboard the Orion spacecraft, launched by the massive SLS rocket. Over roughly 10 days, the crew will travel around the moon, reaching as far as about 7,400 kilometers beyond the lunar far side. The mission will test life support systems, re-entry performance, and other critical technologies, paving the way for future lunar landings. At this point, both the rocket and spacecraft are fully assembled. The crew has just completed a full countdown rehearsal, and rollout to the Launchpad is expected within the next few weeks. NASA is sounding very optimistic about the schedule. That said, like many major space missions, Artemis 2 could still face delays, mostly for safety reasons. After the Artemis 1 mission, NASA chose not to replace Orion's heat shield. Instead, engineers adjusted the re-entry trajectory, shortening the skip phase to reduce the time the spacecraft spends in extreme heating conditions, limiting gas buildup beneath the shield. NASA believes this approach is safe for a crewed flight. The issue centers on Orion's heat shield, made from a special material called Avcoat. During Artemis the Fern, the shield ultimately did its job. The spacecraft returned safely, but parts of the material burned away and flaked off in a more irregular way than expected. Instead of wearing down evenly, sections cracked and broke off in chunks, leaving the capsule looking like it had just come back from a war. And that was an uncrewed mission. With astronauts on board, the stakes are obviously much higher. For that reason, February 5th or 6th should be viewed as a target, not a firm commitment. Delays of a few days, or even a few weeks, are entirely possible. NASA could easily cite the need for additional safety reviews for Orion, and a slip into March or even April would not be surprising. When dealing with a mission this complex, caution isn't just reasonable, it's necessary. Fortunately, NASA has investigated the issue in depth, running more than 100 tests. Engineers identified the root cause as gas buildup linked to the original re-entry trajectory, and addressed it by shortening the re-entry profile for Artemis 2. This approach reduces risk without requiring a brand new heat shield. Other issues, including the life support system and onboard batteries, have also been resolved. Even so, many observers are still watching closely to see whether Artemis 2 actually launches in February, March, or April, each option reflecting a different balance between schedule pressure and the careful management of crew safety. However, if Artemis 2 were to be delayed again, purely because of hardware issues, it would only strengthen the case for the government to move toward canceling SLS and Orion altogether. From the very beginning, both programs have been on the list of potential cuts or cancellations, with some proposals even suggesting they could be retired after Artemis 3. Recent comments from NASA's new administrator, Jared Isaacman, have only intensified this debate. Isaacman has been unusually blunt in his assessments of NASA's existing systems. Regarding Orion, he pointed out that the spacecraft is roughly 20 years old and, despite its long development history, has never carried a crew prior to Artemis 2. He also emphasized the seriousness of the heat shield issues observed after Artemis 1. Turning to SLS, Isaacman highlighted a recent solid rocket booster test that ended with an unusual anomaly. He also reiterated long-standing concerns about quality control, particularly involving the exploration upper stage, which falls under Boeing's responsibility. All of this could put NASA officials in an awkward position. Former Administrator Jim Bridenstine, for example, has publicly criticized aspects of the current Artemis architecture while still supporting continued use of SLS, at one point even proposing dual launch strategies to compensate for its limitations. That kind of contradiction highlights a deeper problem. As confidence in NASA's legacy systems continues to erode, the agency is being forced to rely more heavily on external solutions. As uncertainty continues to hang over aging programs like SLS and Orion, the commercial space sector, led by SpaceX, is rapidly becoming the primary driver and possibly the decisive force behind the future of Artemis and the global race back to the moon. At the center of this historic shift is Starship, not just as a vehicle, but as the true, irreplaceable backbone of the current Artemis architecture and of sustainable lunar missions in the years ahead. Soon we'll once again witness SpaceX putting a Starship to the test with Flight 12 at Starbase, a major event attracting attention not just across the US, but around the world. That's why, even before the flight takes off, every move on Ship 39 and Booster 19 is closely watched. Back in early December, Ship 39 was revealed behind the doors of Mega Bay 2, where it had just gone through the final assembly steps. It looked sleek, solid, and fully finished, with its ceramic heat shield now completely installed. Many assumed it would be rolled out to Massey quickly, since the next steps, cryogenic testing to check the fuel tank structure, engine installation, and a static fire test, follow a well-known sequence. But that didn't happen. Ship 39 has remained in Mega Bay 2 up to now. There are two main reasons for this. First, SpaceX is still building a dedicated area at the Massey site, temporarily called the truss structure, designed to support faster and safer cryogenic proof testing and static fires. Ship 39 isn't expected to roll out until this new facility is complete, which should be in just over a week. The second reason comes from what happened after the Booster 18 incident at the Massey site, just about a week before Ship 39 was completed. SpaceX realized everything was delayed, and with the moon mission timeline starting to tighten, they had to accelerate testing. This meant changing the strategy for Ship 39 while Booster 19 was being finished in Mega Bay 1. The clearest sign of this came on January 2nd, when Ship 39 made a rare appearance again after the building doors opened. But this time, it was surrounded by lots of new scaffolding, suggesting that SpaceX had quietly upgraded something on the spacecraft. In my view, it's the heat shield. What do you think? If you agree, drop a 1 in the comments. It's almost certainly the heat shield. Many speculate this was a sign that tiles were being removed and replaced. Ship 39 is the first V3, and SpaceX is actively experimenting with creating a heat shield that's both strong and reusable, allowing for rapid turnaround between flights. Imagine this. A Starship completes a mission, lands on Mechazilla. The giant chopsticks stack it with awaiting super heavy, refuel, and launch again. Testing new materials is an essential part of making that vision possible. And speaking of materials, could they be trying something like the Dragon capsule's heat shield? After all, Dragon has proven itself as a reliable ISS transport, flying dozens of missions safely. It uses Pica X, a material that ablates to absorb and dissipate the extreme heat during re-entry from low Earth orbit, handling temperatures around 1,600 to 2,000 degrees Celsius. But after every flight, parts of Dragon's heat shield need inspection and often partial replacement, so it doesn't meet SpaceX's criteria for rapid, reusable Starship operations. And there's another possible reason. Originally, SpaceX planned for Flight 12 to continue the heat shield testing pattern used in the 5 Starship V2 flights in 2025. Back then, they would remove tiles in key areas, strip away the ablative layer, and combine it with advanced maneuvers to really push Ship 39 to its limits. If it survived, that would prove the basic design was more resilient than expected. These tests taught SpaceX which areas could handle flight without tiles and which needed extra reinforcement. That's why they've spent extra time installing additional heat shield tiles in those critical spots, speeding up the process so that Flight 12 could potentially reach orbit. If re-entry goes smoothly, there's even a chance Ship 39 could land on Mechazilla for the first time. Unlike a flight where the heat shield is partially removed, this fully shielded test makes that outcome much more likely. If successful, it would be a historic milestone, showing once again that Starship can truly be fully reusable. But installing extra heat shield tiles alone couldn't possibly account for all the time Ship 39 has been in Megabay 2. During this period, the spacecraft also received a much larger update, the addition of Crunch Wrap. Crunch Wrap, a flexible ablative sealant layer, playfully nicknamed the Crunch Wrap Supreme after Taco Bell, is designed to fill gaps between tiles without traditional gap fillers. It was first introduced and tested on Flight 10, mainly on the nose cone, applied like a fabric-looking layer to seal tiles, trim edges flush, and prevent plasma intrusion. This time, SpaceX didn't stop at the nose cone. They also applied Crunch Wrap to the body and the flaps. Elon Musk himself praised the material after Flight 10, saying, "The new heat shield performed much better. That was the main objective." Results from Flight 10 showed Crunch Wrap worked well in most areas, preventing serious tile wear or oxidation, though some spots still needed improvements, like orange residue on the edges. By Flight 11, its use had expanded, signaling that SpaceX was ramping up Crunch Wrap to seal the tiles, the main lesson from the recent V2 flights. And in V3, it's being used even more extensively. Applying Crunch Wrap on Ship 39 reduces plasma heating issues and prevents it from seeping into the stainless steel structure underneath, ensuring the spacecraft's safety during harsh re-entry. If Flight 12 succeeds with this system, it points to a very bright future for the entire Starship V3 fleet, paving the way for ship-to-ship orbital refueling tests and even a trial flight by mid-year. This Crunch Wrap innovation builds directly on lessons from earlier experiments like those in Flight 10. Alongside testing the new sealant, SpaceX was quietly exploring an even bolder idea, replacing a few of the hexagonal ceramic tiles with metallic versions made from heat-resistant stainless steel. Sounds clever, right? But reality was less forgiving. According to Elon Musk himself, during re-entry these metal tiles reacted aggressively with superheated oxygen, causing severe oxidation and leaving a massive orange discoloration right in the middle of the vehicle. Even though Starship still landed precisely in the Indian Ocean, the visible damage was a clear warning sign. It showed that the system needed urgent improvement if SpaceX wanted to avoid slowing down its rapid reuse goals, because even minor damage can mean the time-consuming refurbishment, which goes directly against SpaceX's vision of flying again and again with minimal turnaround. By the time Flight 11 came around, SpaceX made a clean break from metallic tiles and fully committed to refining the ceramic heat shield, this time with much tighter sealing. Even though erosion remains Starship's #1 enemy, the TPS, its thermal protection system, has shown remarkable strength, especially when pushed to the edge. And Flight 11 was the ultimate stress test. SpaceX engineers deliberately sabotaged the vehicle by removing around 72 ceramic tiles across 18 of the hottest regions, leaving no ablative backup layer underneath. That meant bare stainless steel was exposed directly to the roaring plasma of re-entry. The goal? To collect critical data for developing lighter, more efficient heat shields in the future. possibly ones that don't even need full coverage. They pushed everything to the absolute limit, and honestly, it felt like everyone was bracing for a potential rud. But then came the surprise. Starship fought back and performed far better than expected. The vehicle held together impressively, showing only minor discoloration, far less severe than what we saw on Flight 10, and likely a direct result of the intentional tile removals. Post-flight analysis revealed something truly striking. Starship is extremely resilient, even under intense punishment. So far, both of the most recent Starship launches that re-entered the atmosphere without losing control have survived, a powerful sign that SpaceX is closer than ever to achieving rapid, full reusability. That means for Flight 12, with the heat shield in its best condition yet, we're likely to see more clearly than ever just how far Starship has matured, and just how incredibly tough SpaceX has made this vehicle. And of course, to prepare for what could be a historic flight, activity at Starbase, especially around Launchpad 2, has been incredibly busy. On January 6th, the moment many of us had been waiting for finally arrived. The SQD arm extension for Pad 2 was rolled out to the site. This is the hardware responsible for fueling and stabilizing Starship once it's stacked on top of Super Heavy and ready for launch. What's really impressive is how fast things moved after that. Despite its massive size, by January 8th, the installation was already nearly complete. On that same day, right beneath the SQD arm, SpaceX lowered the chopsticks to run movement tests, swinging them left and right to check the stability of the newly upgraded actuators installed not long ago. It was another clear sign that Pad 2 is being pushed closer and closer to flight readiness. But that still wasn't the full picture. Recently, SpaceX has also been installing additional clamp arms on the orbital launch mount at Pad 2. These clamps are a critical part of the launch system, designed to hold the full weight of Super Heavy and Starship when stacked during fueling, checkouts, and engine startup before releasing the vehicle cleanly at liftoff. By January 8th, 12 of these clamp assemblies were already in place, showing just how quickly progress is moving. All of this rapid installation work strongly suggests that Flight 12 may be coming sooner than expected. So, are you feeling the excitement yet? If you are, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more Starship updates right here. Now for another interesting development. Recently, the U.S. Congress pushed back against President Donald Trump's proposal to sharply cut NASA's budget for fiscal year 2026. Trump had suggested reducing NASA's funding by around $6 billion, bringing it down to roughly $18 to $19 billion in order to prioritize defense and economic spending. But, as always, proposals are one thing. Final decisions rest with Congress. Bipartisan committees in both the House and Senate reached an agreement under a minibus spending package, allocating about $24.4 billion to NASA. That's only a modest cut of around 2%. Or roughly $400 million compared to 2025. Crucially, this move protects NASA's core missions in space exploration and scientific research, while also rejecting plans to eliminate its STEM education programs. This outcome is especially beneficial for SpaceX, particularly in the race back to the moon through the Artemis program. SpaceX is the primary contractor for NASA's human landing system, with Starship selected to land astronauts on the moon during Artemis 3, currently targeted for 2027 to 2028. A stable NASA budget means those multi-billion-dollar contracts remain firmly in place. Looking deeper, this decision does more than just keep money flowing. It helps NASA and SpaceX push Starship forward despite ongoing cost and schedule challenges, while also strengthening America's competitive position against China, which is rapidly advancing its Tiangong space station and targeting a crewed lunar landing in the 2030s. At the same time, it gives SpaceX room to expand its commercial ventures, like Starlink and private missions, while reducing financial risk by continuing to leverage NASA's infrastructure and long-term support. China recently made a big show out of testing a so-called blurred retro thrust system on a vehicle called CYZ-1. With Beijing repeatedly claiming it will land astronauts on the moon before 2030, many observers initially assumed this was a serious lunar spacecraft, something along the lines of NASA's Orion, meant to carry crews to lunar orbit, dock with the Lanyu lander, and support an actual moon landing, similar to the Orion Starship HLS architecture. But that assumption collapsed almost immediately. It turns out CYZ-1 isn't a lunar spacecraft at all. It's actually a suborbital space tourism vehicle, borrowing heavily from Blue Origin's New Shepard concept. Its mission is simple: fly past the Kármán line at 100 kilometers, give passengers a few minutes of weightlessness, and then return to Earth. That's also why the vehicle doesn't look especially tough or flight-tested. Honestly, it looks more like something made of plastic than a spacecraft built for deep space. And even if this vehicle were more advanced, more durable, and more powerful than NASA's Orion, that still wouldn't guarantee CNSA a win in the race to the moon. Because just recently, President Donald Trump signed an executive order described by NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman as the most important space policy since the Kennedy era. It commits the United States to fast-tracking moon programs, especially Artemis, with a clear goal: return to the moon, establish a permanent presence, and do it before China reaches 2030. And the benefits showed up almost immediately. That executive order played a major role in pushing SpaceX's valuation to around $800 billion, because investors suddenly saw where U.S. space policy is heading. Washington is now clearly leaning toward Elon Musk's commercial model, and that matters because SpaceX controls Starbase, often described as the city of Starship. The place is built around the most powerful launch vehicle ever created, and the one that is increasingly seen as the vehicle that will carry Americans back to the moon. In other words, when the U.S. government commits to the moon, SpaceX is the company positioned to deliver. And here's the real question. If this executive order commits the United States to putting humans back on the moon by 2028, is Elon Musk truly ready for a mission this bold, with barely 2 years left to prepare? To find the answer, let's break it down. This is arguably the best moment in SpaceX's history. The company now has not only the full backing of the U.S. government, but also strong alignment from NASA itself. That means it's only a matter of time before billions of dollars in funding flow in to complete critical Starship variants: the depot, the tankers, and the HLS. On top of that, SpaceX has just received a fresh wave of investment, with investors lining up to buy in. So, money isn't the problem. Political support isn't the problem. Industry partnerships aren't the problem either. The one thing SpaceX doesn't have in abundance is time to execute a plan that was originally designed on a far more relaxed schedule. According to an internal SpaceX document that leaked last month, the company's current roadmap reveals something striking. In June 2026, SpaceX plans to conduct its first on-orbit propellant transfer test between 2 starships. In June 2027, an uncrewed lunar landing. And by September 2028, astronauts on the lunar surface. It's very possible this roadmap was submitted to NASA, which then triggered direct government intervention, pushing Artemis 3, the first Starship HLS mission, to September 2028. And that has major implications. From the first Starship flight in Q1 2026 to June of that same year, SpaceX would need to pull off an extraordinary series of milestones: reaching orbit reliably, catching both Super Heavy and Starship with the launch tower, and validating core systems, all within an incredibly tight window. Realistically, that leaves room for maybe 3 flights, or 4 at best, if launch cadence ramps up aggressively. And if something goes wrong on, say, Flight 12, then the June 2026 orbital refueling milestone suddenly looks extremely ambitious. Still, this is SpaceX we're talking about. This is the same company that nearly went bankrupt after 3 consecutive Falcon 1 failures, and then went on to build Falcon 9, a rocket that now flies routinely and reliably. So, while the timeline is brutal, history suggests one thing clearly. With SpaceX, the impossible has a habit of becoming reality. And to be honest, this isn't just speculation. SpaceX genuinely believes it can take on a whole series of extremely demanding lunar missions within just 2 years by turning complex problems into simple, repeatable solutions. You can see that confidence directly on SpaceX's own website. After criticism from former NASA officials like Jim Bridenstine, who argued that SpaceX's Artemis III architecture was overly complex, SpaceX responded by saying, In response to the latest calls, we've shared and are formally assessing a simplified mission architecture and concept of operations that we believe will result in a faster return to the moon while simultaneously improving crew safety. Exactly. They really have simplified the lunar architecture to the point where astronauts could return to the moon in such a short time frame. But what does simplification actually mean in this context? Most experts believe SpaceX is referring to an expendable version of Starship, a vehicle designed to be used only once. Think about that for a moment. SpaceX, a company that has been obsessed with reusability for more than a decade, appears willing to throw starships away just to meet this timeline. That alone shows how serious the current race has become. An expendable variant would eliminate the heat shield, the forward and aft flaps, essentially everything required for atmospheric re-entry. All it needs to do is get tanker starships to orbit and deliver as much propellant as possible to the Starship depot. The result is a dramatically lighter vehicle, up to 20% lighter, with a dry mass of roughly 80 tons. That means faster construction and the ability to carry up to 250 tons of propellant to low Earth orbit, far more than reusable versions. Starship HLS only needs around 1,000 to 1,200 tons of fuel to reach lunar orbit, dock with Orion, transfer the crew, descend vertically to the moon, complete the mission, and still have enough propellant to return to lunar orbit, rendezvous again, and bring the astronauts home. Which means that even for a mission, this ambitious SpaceX would only need 4 to 5 expendable starships for orbital refueling. That's dramatically simpler than earlier expert estimates, which range from 10 to 16 tanker launches. And as you know, the more launches you add, the risk doesn't just increase, it multiplies. That's why the orbital refueling test planned for June 2026 is absolutely critical. It's the point where real-world data finally replaces theoretical estimates. What happens if the first test shows the process takes twice as long as expected, or requires twice as many tanker launches? Those are the kinds of questions keeping both NASA and SpaceX engineers awake at night. However, SpaceX isn't the only player making bold, aggressive moves in the race back to the moon. Blue Origin CEO Dave Limp has recently sent some very encouraging signals about helping NASA accelerate the Artemis timeline, not just to stay ahead of China, but potentially to challenge SpaceX head-on, and even replace them for Artemis 3 if the opportunity arises. When asked about speeding up crewed lunar landings, Limp emphasized that Blue Origin could completely skip orbital refueling for early missions, a massive technical risk that SpaceX's Starship is still struggling to fully prove. That's made possible by Blue Origin's focus on Blue Moon Mark 1, a much smaller, Apollo-style lander. Because of its compact design, it requires only a single launch and avoids the complexity of tanker refueling altogether. This is where Blue Origin's approach really stands out. It's built around proven technology and risk reduction, ideal for hitting early deadlines. But, on the other hand, SpaceX's Starship is the truly revolutionary option. It promises enormous payload capacity and full reusability, not just landing astronauts on the moon, but delivering hundreds of tons of cargo, enabling the construction of a sustained human presence on the lunar surface. NASA now finds itself at a clear crossroads. One path offers speed and safety, helping the U.S. secure leadership in the lunar race. The other offers long-term, game-changing potential, but with far more uncertainty. With pressure from China continuing to rise, where would you place your bet? SpaceX or Blue Origin? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. But personally, I'd still put my money on SpaceX, because they're the only ones seriously aligned with something explicitly mentioned in a U.S. executive order: nuclear power. By 2030, NASA wants to have a working fission reactor on the surface of the moon, and the reason is simple: energy density. Early plans relied heavily on large solar farms on the moon, but that immediately runs into a brutal problem. Lunar nights last 2 full weeks. On top of that, lunar regolith is highly abrasive, slightly magnetic, and sticks to everything. So once you deploy solar panels, you also need autonomous robots just to keep them clean. A nuclear reactor, by contrast, provides stable, reliable power, regardless of sunlight. And if you're serious about building permanent lunar infrastructure, mining operations, manufacturing facilities, large-scale life support systems, you simply can't do that without continuous power. There's no workaround. That's exactly why, in December 2025, Roscosmos, Russia's national space agency, signed a major state contract with NPO Lavochkin, one of the country's top space design bureaus. The goal, to develop and build a lunar power plant, targeted to be operational by 2036. Official documents carefully avoid using the word nuclear, but the project directly involves Rosatom and the Kurchatov Institute, Russia's two biggest names in nuclear energy. So most experts in international media are almost certain this is a small nuclear fission reactor designed specifically for the moon. At this point, this is no longer just about exploration. This is about industrialization. For the United States, the executive order explicitly calls for the development of space-based nuclear power, both for lunar surface operations and for systems in Earth orbit. In plain terms, they're planning infrastructure that supports long-term, sustainable activity, not short visits. And more importantly, they're planning to outpace both Russia and China. 2026 is shaping up to be a truly breakthrough year for SpaceX. Beyond updates to Starship version 3, Launchpad 2, and the Massey site, there's been relatively little discussion about Launch Complex 39A, the site of SpaceX's first launch pad in Florida, which the company has been building since December 2021. Now, at the start of 2026, it's finally nearing completion after a series of major upgrades, including the installation of the tank farm, flame trench, and the orbital launch mount. The site has already cleared 3 of the 4 main steps, with detailed environmental assessments and consultations with relevant agencies completed. What remains is finalizing the paperwork and issuing the record of decision, the official authorization to proceed. According to the U.S. government's official permitting dashboard, the environmental impact statement is expected to be finalized by January 30th, 2026. It's taken quite some time, largely because LC-39A is shared with NASA and the Artemis program, requiring careful analysis of risks like sonic booms and debris. The FAA is also waiting for real-world data from Starship V3 test flights at Starbase to update its assessments as accurately as possible. Once the EIS is complete and the ROD is signed, SpaceX will still need final approvals from the FAA and Space Force. These steps could take additional time, meaning the first Starship flight from Florida could happen in Q2 2026, or slightly later, depending on the pace of testing in Texas. There's another factor to consider: the time it will take to transport Starship and Super Heavy to Kennedy Space Center. Clearly, as of now, they can't produce Starship in Florida yet. Of course, they are building the Gigabay there to support mass production of Starships, but by the time the launch pad is fully approved, it won't be ready in time. The only way they can speed up the first flight from the Starship launch pad at LC-39A is to transport the vehicles from Texas. Recently, SpaceX Vice President of Launch, Kiko Donchev, confirmed this. On X, Kiko replied directly to user Julia Bergeron, who had shared photos and videos of the barge Marmac 31 spotted near the Starbase port, suspected to be the ship that will carry Starship. Kiko wrote, "Good eye. Still needs a little work before we put the name on it, but it was a good first trial run of a transport. From this, we can be pretty certain that SpaceX is currently testing and refining the barge. It doesn't have an official name yet, but if Elon Musk's post from September is any indication, the barge will eventually be called You'll Thank Me Later." This fits even more when you consider another post from Kiko, that same month revealing that SpaceX decided to position the vehicles horizontally for safer and easier transport by sea to Cape Canaveral. Initially, each trip will carry just one booster or one Starship, but the plan is to quickly move multiple vehicles at once to improve efficiency. And now, with testing underway using the Marmac 31, a 260-foot-long, 72-foot-wide deck barge, this marks the first dedicated trial for transporting a full vehicle. It won't be long before a Super Heavy Starship pair makes its journey from Texas to Florida by sea. But the big question is, which Starship will it be? Let's break it down. According to SpaceX's current plan, by June 2026, the company aims to conduct an orbital refilling test flight. That means 2 Starships will launch into orbit, dock with each other, transfer propellant from one vehicle to the other, and then return for landing at Mechazilla. To pull this off, SpaceX will need 2 Starships, 2 Super Heavy boosters, and 2 launch towers. Based on the current schedule, Ship 39 and Booster 19 are assigned to the upcoming Flight 12, expected around January. If vehicle completion continues at roughly one pair every 2 months, then Ship 40 and Booster 20 would be ready by early April, followed by Ship 41 and Booster 21 around June. That makes it very likely that Ship 40 and Booster 20 will be the first pair transported to Florida shortly after their completion around April, and also the first to be moved by barge. And that matters because sea transport takes time. The route from Texas to Florida is over 1,000 nautical miles, roughly 1,850 kilometers, following a path through the Gulf of America and around the Florida Peninsula for safety. For heavy cargo barges, pure transit time typically ranges from 4 to 7 days. But once you factor in horizontal loading, crane operations, securing the vehicles, offloading, and final transport to LC-39A, a full shipment could take 1 to 2 weeks. Initially, as Kiko mentioned, SpaceX plans to transport only one vehicle per trip, which means 2 separate barge journeys, one for the booster and one for the ship. That adds even more time before everything is in place for the June orbital refueling test. As for Ship 41 and Booster 21, those will be produced and flown from Starbase, so they won't need to be transported at all. But does that mean SpaceX will have a 4-month gap from February after Flight 12 until June with no Starship activity? Of course not. After Flight 12, SpaceX will have a huge amount of work to do, collecting and analyzing flight data, identifying issues, and refining the design. Since Flight 12 will be the first flight of Starship version 3, problems are not just possible, they're expected. That window gives SpaceX time to iterate and improve before the much more critical orbital refilling mission. And that's crucial because while Flight 12 can tolerate setbacks, a mission like Flight 13, expected to demonstrate orbital refueling, absolutely cannot fail. It's a key link in the chain leading toward Artemis 3 in 2028, and any mistake there would ripple through the entire program. However, that's only one scenario. There's another possibility. If SpaceX is unable to carry out the orbital refueling test in June, as planned due to technical or schedule issues, the timeline could slip to around August. In that case, Flight 14 would become the orbital refueling mission, and Ship 41 and Booster 21 would be the pair transported instead. Either way, the test will almost certainly have to happen this year. That gives SpaceX less than a year to fully master orbital refueling, because according to the current roadmap, June 2027 is targeted for an uncrewed Starship HLS lunar landing, a critical milestone required to certify the vehicle for carrying astronauts. And that potential gap in the schedule opens up another opportunity. When I mentioned a possible 2-month delay earlier, it could allow SpaceX to insert an additional test flight, something like Flight 13, to experiment with Starship's point-to-point capability. In other words, a flight from Texas to Florida, or potentially even farther, to demonstrate rapid transportation on Earth. This flight architecture could directly support SpaceX's involvement in the rocket cargo program, led by the U.S. Air Force Research Laboratory and U.S. Transportation Command. Back in 2022, SpaceX was awarded a $102 million contract to study Starship-based cargo transport, collect flight data, design cargo configurations compatible with military container standards, and prepare for demonstrations involving heavy cargo landings. But why would the military be interested in a spacecraft for logistics? After all, Starship isn't a flying truck. The answer is cost and capability. Starship's projected launch cost is well under $10 million per flight, combined with enormous logistics potential, the ability to deliver up to 200 tons of cargo anywhere on Earth in under an hour. That kind of capability is extremely attractive for battlefield support, humanitarian aid, and rapid deployment. Exactly the kinds of missions the U.S. military cares about. So the idea here is that during Flight 13, SpaceX could transport Ship 40 and Booster 20 to LC-39A, launch from Florida, and then split the mission profile. Booster 20 would still return and land back to the launch tower since it would only fly for a few minutes. Ship 40, after deploying test satellites, could adjust its trajectory rather than returning to Florida. It would fly back and land at Starbase, Texas. A flight like that would be nearly perfect for collecting real-world data for the Department of Defense. And if successful, it could mark the first real step toward operational cargo demonstrations between 2026 and 2028, potentially leading to billions of dollars in additional contracts for SpaceX to develop a dedicated Starship variant for this mission, often referred to as Starship P2P. However, there are several reasons why this plan is unlikely to be executed in 2026. Since the start of the new year, SpaceX has effectively entered a full-on sprint mode, focused on delivering the must-have milestones for the Artemis moon program, not on experimenting with optional missions. First and foremost, all effort is being poured into the orbital refueling demonstration, targeted for around June 2026. This is the single most critical milestone. Without orbital refueling, missions to the moon, let alone Mars, are simply not possible. Achieving this will require numerous flights to test docking, propellant transfer between two starships, and all the operational edge cases that come with it. As a result, nearly all available resources are being directed toward this objective. Second, catching Starship itself with the chopsticks is the next major goal, expected to take place during Flight 13 or possibly Flight 14. The booster has already been caught. Now it's the ship's turn. This step is crucial because it determines whether Starship tankers can be rapidly reused at scale. Third, SpaceX still needs to conduct long-duration orbital flights, keeping Starship in orbit for extended periods and relighting its engines multiple times. These tests are essential preparation for deep space missions and lunar operations. In short, virtually every Starship flight in 2026 is designed to collect data specifically for the moon program. There's simply no room to squeeze in point-to-point testing. Compared to orbital refueling and ship recovery, P2P remains a low-priority objective. Even if SpaceX were to conduct tests related to the U.S. military's rocket cargo program, they would almost certainly choose remote, sparsely populated locations, places like Johnston Atoll or other isolated areas, to minimize risk. Flying over dense population corridors like the Texas-Florida route would be a non-starter, given the extreme sonic booms and debris risks involved. The FAA would almost certainly block such a test immediately. Regardless of the location, SpaceX will have to carefully consider maritime shipping routes. The designated recovery zones sit within some of the busiest shipping corridors in the world. SpaceX will need to ensure not only that landings are conducted safely, but also that Starship recovery operations do not disrupt or interfere with other industries. Beyond the necessary infrastructure and operational preparations, SpaceX must also achieve several critical flight milestones. Many of these are directly tied to landing performance and vehicle control. The company still needs to further refine its mastery of vehicle control. Super Heavy, at this point, can largely be considered well under control, as demonstrated by multiple successful Mechazilla catches in late 2024 and early 2025. Splashdown, landing a spacecraft under parachutes into the ocean, became a defining symbol of the U.S. space program back in the 1960s. At the time, it was considered the safest possible landing method. Water absorbs impact far better than solid ground, significantly reducing the risk of explosions or serious injuries to astronauts. That's why nearly every Apollo mission, from Apollo 7 to Apollo 17, ended with a successful splashdown in the Pacific Ocean, followed by rapid recovery by U.S. Navy aircraft carriers. And that legacy continues today. NASA still relies on splashdowns for SpaceX's Dragon capsules. Then there's Orion, NASA's own spacecraft built for the Artemis program. Like Dragon, Orion deploys parachutes, splashes down in the ocean, and enters the recovery phase, where large ships secure the capsule, extract the crew, and transport the vehicle back to shore. But here's the twist. Despite NASA having decades of experience with splashdown recovery, its performance is often seen as far less efficient than SpaceX's. To understand why, we need to take a closer look at Orion's recovery after the Artemis 1 mission. On December 11, 2022, NASA's Orion spacecraft safely returned to Earth, marking a clean and successful end to the uncrewed Artemis 1 mission. Orion splashed down gently in the Pacific Ocean, off the coast of Baja California. Soon after, a joint NASA-U.S. Navy recovery team aboard the amphibious assault ship USS Portland moved in to secure the capsule. Because Artemis, I was a test mission. The first 2 hours were deliberately spent conducting detailed on-water scientific inspections, collecting critical data on the heat shield and the spacecraft's overall condition. Only after that did the recovery team begin the process of attaching tow lines, stabilizing the capsule, and slowly guiding Orion into the ship's flooded well deck, a procedure that took several more hours. In total, it took nearly 5 hours after splashdown for Orion to be fully secured inside the USS Portland. Now, compare that with SpaceX. Even though Crew Dragon only entered service in 2020, SpaceX quickly mastered the recovery process, far more efficiently than an agency with over half a century of spacecraft operations. In most missions, SpaceX recovers Crew Dragon in 45 minutes to about an hour. The fastest recovery ever took just 27 minutes, measured from splashdown to the capsule being lifted onto the recovery ship during NASA's SpaceX Crew 9 mission, which successfully brought home Suni Williams and Butch Wilmore. Do the math. That's several times faster than NASA's Orion recovery during Artemis 1. This isn't about speed for the sake of competition. It's about operational efficiency, and more importantly, getting astronauts out of the capsule quickly for medical evaluation and emergency care if needed. History shows why this matters. In April 2008, South Korean astronaut Yi So-yeon returned aboard Soyuz TMA-11, which performed a ballistic re-entry, much steeper than normal, exposing her to up to 10 Gs. She suffered severe back pain after landing and required immediate hospitalization. Now, imagine if she had been forced to remain inside the capsule, drifting at sea for 3 more hours. The outcome could have been far worse. Situations like this are extremely rare on Crew Dragon, currently the safest and most advanced crewed spacecraft flying to the ISS. It's not an aging Soyuz, and it's not Orion either, a vehicle designed for deep space missions, where the physical risks to astronauts are inherently higher. So, how does SpaceX manage to recover Crew Dragon that fast? First, SpaceX carefully pre-selects its splashdown locations. Crew Dragon typically lands relatively close to shore, usually off the coasts of Florida or California, at distances of roughly 20 to 200 nautical miles. This dramatically shortens recovery ship transit time, while still keeping the area far enough offshore to ensure that trunk debris poses no risk to populated areas. Orion, on the other hand, followed a very different profile during Artemis 1. The original plan was to splash down closer to San Diego, at distances of around 50 to 300 miles. However, due to weather conditions, the landing zone was shifted much farther south, to roughly 300 to 550 kilometers offshore. That decision made sense from a safety and naval operations standpoint. It placed Orion in a calmer recovery environment and allowed the use of large U.S. Navy recovery vessels. But the trade-off was clear. Greater distance from shore meant longer transit times and ultimately a slower recovery process compared to Crew Dragon. Second, SpaceX uses dedicated recovery ships. Vessels like Megan or Shannon are offshore ships that SpaceX converted from older oil support vessels. They are pre-positioned with compact teams of around 20 to 30 people, including engineers, divers, and medical staff, all focused on one task: recovering Dragon. NASA takes a very different approach. For Orion, it relies on large U.S. Navy ships, such as USS Portland. These ships look impressive, but they're also bulkier, more complex, and come with layers of procedures designed for multi-role military operations, not rapid spacecraft recovery. SpaceX's ships are smaller, more agile, and purpose-built. They do one job, and they do it efficiently. That specialization alone removes a lot of friction from the recovery timeline. Smaller ships also give SpaceX more flexibility to upgrade its fleet. Megan, for example, completed its final East Coast recovery mission during Crew 9 in 2025, successfully bringing home 2 NASA astronauts who had been stranded. It was later retired in Louisiana, not because it was failing, but because it no longer fit SpaceX's cost strategy. Older vessels are expensive to maintain. SpaceX is now transitioning to newer recovery ships to further reduce operating costs. And that fits perfectly with SpaceX's broader philosophy: make everything reusable and make every operation as efficient as possible. Third, SpaceX runs a far more streamlined recovery sequence. As soon as the recovery ships reach Crew Dragon, small fast boats are deployed first. Their job is to perform immediate safety checks, looking for propellant leaks, toxic vapors, or any other hazards. If something is detected, it can be handled on the spot using specialized equipment. Once the capsule is declared safe, Dragon is quickly secured and lifted onto the recovery ship by crane. Unlike NASA's Orion, which must be towed into a flooded well deck, Dragon is placed directly on an open deck, eliminating several time-consuming steps. With the capsule already on deck, astronauts are assisted out almost immediately and move straight into the ship's medical area. A helicopter is typically standing by, ready to fly the crew back to shore without delay. Even for cargo missions, this speed matters. Scientific experiments and sensitive hardware can be returned to Kennedy Space Center much faster, preserving data from time-critical research. In short, SpaceX treats recovery not as a ceremonial finale, but as a continuation of the mission itself. Now, if we look at this from another angle, NASA absolutely deserves credit for doing its job extremely well. SpaceX recovers Crew Dragon faster, not just because of optimized procedures, but because the spacecraft itself is lighter and more compact, roughly 9 to 10 metric tons at re-entry, and specifically designed for LEO missions with lower re-entry speeds. Orion, by contrast, is larger and heavier, with the crew module weighing around 10 to 11 metric tons. More importantly, Artemis missions are fundamentally different. They last weeks to months around the moon, and when Orion returns, it hits the atmosphere at much higher velocities, about 11 kilometers per second, compared to roughly 7.5 kilometers per second for Dragon. That higher energy re-entry places far greater stress on both the spacecraft and the crew. As a result, NASA prioritizes maximum safety and extensive medical and structural checks before opening the hatch and extracting astronauts, even if that means accepting a longer recovery timeline. In short, both systems work, but they're optimized for very different missions. SpaceX's approach is faster and more efficient, built around the needs of commercial, repeatable spaceflight. NASA's approach is proven and meticulous, but inevitably slower and more resource-intensive, reflecting the realities of deep space exploration. At the end of the day, we know splashdown is extremely safe, but what about landing on solid ground? Which approach is actually better? The truth is, there's no universally better method, only what's more appropriate for a given design and mission. Take Boeing's Starliner and SpaceX's Crew Dragon. Starliner is certified to land on land, while Dragon is required by NASA to splash down, even though Elon Musk originally wanted Dragon to perform propulsive landings using Super Draco engines, with splashdown as a backup. So, was NASA favoring Boeing? Not at all. SpaceX voluntarily abandoned propulsive landings in 2017. NASA required high redundancy, meaning parachutes were mandatory anyway, and propulsive landing was still considered too new and too risky, especially given the explosion hazards of hypergolic propellants. Starliner, on the other hand, was designed from the start to land on land, using a combination of parachutes and airbags, similar to Soyuz. This is a mature, well-understood approach, and that's why NASA approved it under the Commercial Crew Program, not because it's better, but because it adds diversity and redundancy. The trade-off, however, is hard to ignore. While Crew Dragon has flown dozens of missions to the ISS, Starliner has completed only one crewed flight and still has not received full human rating certification for routine operational missions. As a result, Starliner's next ISS flight, currently expected around April 2026, is planned as a cargo mission. After nearly $5 billion invested, everyone is hoping this time nothing goes wrong. But even if Starliner docks successfully, there's a bigger question. Would NASA really trust it to bring back sensitive chemical experiments or high-value scientific data from the ISS? As we've discussed, Starliner lands on solid ground, touching down in the western United States using parachutes, airbags, and small retro-rockets to slow the final descent. This method has been proven by Soyuz, but Soyuz is primarily a crew vehicle, and humans are far more resilient than fragile electronics, biological samples, or chemical experiments. Russia's Progress cargo spacecraft highlights this difference perfectly. It can't return cargo at all. After delivering supplies to the ISS, it's loaded with trash, undocks, re-enters the atmosphere, and burns up, with any remaining debris falling into the Pacific. Even if Progress were equipped with a heat shield like Starliner, the core weakness of land landings remains. Impact forces are significantly higher than splashdown. Solid ground simply doesn't absorb energy the way water does. Despite airbags, landings can still expose the capsule to 5 to 6 GIs at touchdown, something we've seen with Soyuz, where rough landings have caused discomfort to astronauts and damage to onboard equipment. So, if you were an astronaut, which would you choose? Splashdown or a landing on solid ground? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching.